we're finally at a point where we're good enough and it's time to learn about the main types of errors that you could get. So we're going to talk about these three main categories. And it's important to understand these because we're going to, as our code gets more complex, we're going to have more advanced issues and errors, and we need to learn how to manage them. And so far, you've been managing one type, which is the compile type error, right? So the compile type error, let me bring it here. So the compile time errors are easy. We see it basically everywhere when we're coding. When we see those red squiggly lines underneath something or the red highlights, those are basically errors. And that's the compiler, when it compiles our code into runtime code, into binary that it requires, it will say if something is not making sense to it, such as you wrote something that it doesn't know, or you forgot a semicolon, or anything that's not compile ready, right? Anything that's not able to be available to be translated from our human language to a binary language, right? And these are the easiest one because it would tell us exactly the line, the location, and why it happens. So it's actually the easiest one out of all our categories of errors that we get. And because it's the easiest one to manage and to use, we want to try and convert every type of error that we could get or possibility of errors in the future to something in the compile time. And you're going to see that's a much more complicated thing. But those other categories we get, we're going to try and convert them into compile time errors whenever possible. Now, that's for compile time. The next type of error is runtime errors are basically things that happen, but we can't really stop them. So we have to manage them. So these are out of our control. So a good example of this is you're transferring some information from the software to our server and the internet of the user cuts off. We can't really know when the connection is going to cut off. The same thing as what happens when electricity cut off. What if the user's computer is full and there's no more hard drive space? So there's a lot of things that could happen that's not within our control, but we know when it happens, right? The problem with runtime errors, it happens during runtime, so during the execution of your application. And this is bad because, sorry, I had the wrong notes here ready. But this is bad because the user is running it at this moment, right? So when the user runs it, the application crashed. That's one thing that could happen. The application just exited because some error happens and it can't execute further. Now, the good thing is it will always say where and why. And to be honest, we'll know about this when it happens because for each class and method and etc., we specify what type of error could happen at those moments. And I'll show you those things in the next video, right? This error is still easy until it's taken care of. A lot of people, they just ignore them and they move on. A good example of this is when we were taking in the user's input. When we were taking the user's input, we weren't really verifying if they were giving us an integer. So let's say as an example, you did the scanner and then you got the next int, but the user entered a string which said hello. Hello to an integer doesn't really make sense. This would have crashed your application, right? So we have to take care of them. So far, we've been always assuming that everything will work fine, but as we go further in our career, we'll have to manage every little thing. And this is important because if your application crashes, well, there's 100 other applications that are competing with yours. So when an application crashes many times on your phone, what do? You go ahead and delete it. So we got to make sure that the user is always having a good time with our application. And this is important. So this is runtime errors. And again, if we could, we would like to make this into a compile time error, but a lot of times it's just not possible. Okay, and we'll discuss this in the future video. Oops, the wrong thing. So the next type of error, So logic errors are a pain in the butt. This is the worst type of errors that we could have. These are the errors that I wanted to go left in my logic, but I went right. Right? These are the errors where, let's say, if it was a shopping website or something, the user bought large and yellow, but when we got it in our database, it says they bought small and red, right? And the worst part is there is no feedback on these errors. We won't be able to note that if the user misselected something, he did something wrong, or that we did something wrong. This is a really hard type of error to find because it's all about logic. You went left when you should have went right on that street. You bought big when you should have bought small, right? These are the worst type of things you could do. So it's the hardest to fix or to even know it happened. So a lot of times users will message you and say, well, I ordered this thing, but you gave me something else. A lot of times you could see this happening in Amazon. And you could even see, if you look around, sometimes people got 4 or 5 of the package when they only ordered one. And inside Amazon's database, it just says they got one. The worst part is you're losing money without knowing you're losing money, right? To fix this type of error, we need to do a lot of test cases, and that's the only way. We can't rely on our own logic every time. There might be a case that we haven't figured out. As our code gets more complex, as our code gets more people working on it, issues happen. A lot of issues happen. So we need to make these test cases to test our code every step to make sure that we're going in the right direction and there is no issue that we cannot see. So again, lastly, I'm just going to re-emphasize on this. This logic error, these types of errors, there's no way you're going to get any feedback on it. We got to make sure that our test cases come back the same thing. And we'll talk about test cases in the future. So just to recapitulate what we just talked about, there's 3 major types of 3 categories of errors. There's the logic errors, which is the worst one, which we don't want. There's the runtime errors. These are the errors that will happen, which we don't have control, but we know about it, so we could still manage them. And lastly, compile time errors, which we've been seeing nonstop. Those are the best ones because the compiler tells us we have an issue this place here, and I'm not going to let you compile it until you fix that error. So we want to always gravitate towards compile time errors if we could manage those errors. Logic errors is not something you want to manage or deal with, let's say. See you guys in the next video.